I know, I was going to cut him off at the ankles.
Put that in the agenda next year, seconds.
I think we can start. All right, I think we'll go ahead and start the program. I know we've got a couple more people just getting some drinks. So once again, my name is Sean O'Neill, and I am the president of the U.S. Table Tennis Hall of Fame. I'm so thrilled that all of you are here. I want to take a special moment to thank our hostess, Tani Bond, for allowing us to use her beautiful facility. Tani. And also, Major League Table Tennis has made it possible to cover all of the expenses. As many of you have come to previous dinners, we've always charged a reasonable fee for the dinners, but Major League Table Tennis has taken over the entire cost. So I'd like to just read on behalf a message from the founder, Flint Lane, who sent, they've got matches going on this weekend. So he said, on behalf of Major League Table Tennis, I want to congratulate the 2025 U.S. Table Tennis Hall of Fame class. To Betty Henry, your breakthrough on the world stage at such a young age continues to inspire generations. To David Del Vecchio, your passion and dedication behind the camera helped bring table tennis to fans across the country. To Stellan Bengtsson, your lifelong commitment to coaching and developing players has elevated the level of play in the United States and worldwide. And to Connie Suarez, this year's Mark Matthews Lifetime Achievement Award recipient, your leadership, generosity, and grace embody what it means to give back to the sport for a lifetime. Major League Table Tennis is proud to be the title sponsor of this year's Hall of Fame celebration. The history you've created helped make professional table tennis in America possible, and we're grateful for everything that you've done to the game. Congratulations to you all, and enjoy a well-deserved honor. And that's from Flint Lane. And now it's my distinct pleasure to welcome our Master of Ceremonies, Mr. Derek May.
Lower this thing. Thank you, Sean. It's great to see all of you this evening, and it's my honor to be here with all of you to celebrate tonight's honorees. For those of you that don't know this, the U.S. Table Tennis Hall of Fame was established in 1979, and it's an independent 501c3 nonprofit organization with a simple but important mission to honor and recognize outstanding players, officials, and contributors to the sport of table tennis in the United States of America. And that's what tonight is all about. So as I look around the room, I do see several Hall of Famers here, and I was going to make you stand up, but since you're eating, I'm not going to make you do that, but I would like the Hall of Famers to raise your hands that are in the room. Let's give all these a round of applause. Thank you. Thanks all of you for being here and supporting this event. So before we get into the induction ceremony, I want to just take a moment to again thank the sponsors who have made this event possible. First, again, thank you to Flint Lane and Major League Table Tennis, our presenting sponsor. We also extend our gratitude to Dave and Donna Sakai and their company, Sonoda Incorporated, for sponsoring these fantastic programs, as well as the Mark Matthews Lifetime Achievement Award that you'll see later tonight. We appreciate the commitment of all of our sponsors. We wouldn't be having this event if it weren't for them. So with that, it's my pleasure to begin our induction ceremony. Our first inductee will be introduced by longtime president and the driving force behind the South Bend Table Tennis Club, one of the most legendary and active table tennis clubs in the United States. Please help me welcome Mr. Brad Balmer.
Okay, well, you have to bear with me. I don't do this for a living, but I'm the guy from South Bend, kind of the behind the scenes. Everybody knows South Bend, but there's a bunch of people that work behind the scenes to make that opportunity for people, especially kids, to play at our club. I'm the president of the club, been involved with the club for 48 years, started back in about 77. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of try to tell you a story, kind of the history and the legacy, the longevity, and maybe a little bit about the future of our club, and then how Hall of Fame inductee Betty Henry is going to kind of fit into that, into the story. So my story is more on the South Bend side, and then I also like to thank the Henry family for inviting me to come up here. They were nice enough to ask me to give a speech about Betty. But Dennis is going to come up and talk more about Betty and kind of her exploits, you know, in the sport of table tennis. So to begin with, basically, I got to tell you, I'm from Mishawaka, South Bend area, and I grew up a Notre Dame football fan. And if you're a Notre Dame football fan, most of the time, you're kind of a fan of the history and the legacy of one of the, you know, greatest sports institutions there ever was. And my dad built the Coach Parsegian's house when I was a little kid, so I got to sit on the field and watch Notre Dame football next to the players. And so I was really into, you know, the Newt Rockne and the Four Horsemen and the Gipper and all that stuff. It just interests me. I loved history. And then I was a Cub fan. My dad was a Cub fan, and I was a Bear fan, so I was into statistics and the championships and everything that went on with sports in our area. I loved the history part of it. So I'm going to tell you a quick story of what happened. I ended up as a student at Indiana University South Bend, and they had a game room with 3 tables down there. So that's where I started playing table tennis. And I met 3 other guys, Jason Denman, Phil Schmucker, and Dan Rush. We started playing every day. There was a lot of people at the university that played. And one day we decided, well, let's venture out. Let's go play somewhere else. So we found a club in Elkhart, Indiana, and we found one in Michigan City, Indiana, not far from South Bend. And so we went there thinking, you know, we were pretty good, and we found out real fast we weren't quite as good as we thought we were, for sure. So we went back and we continued to practice and get better. And then we decided, well, we're going to go to a tournament. So we decided to go up to, it was Grand Rapids, Michigan. In fact, I got to thinking about it. I think Dell was even there at that tournament, if I remember right. So we're playing, you know, we're trying to make an impact. Obviously, we didn't. But I was sitting there, and then something happened that changed my life forever. An older gentleman came down and sat next to me in the gym, and he says, "Where are you boys from?" And I said, "Well, we're from South Bend." And the guy said, well, and incidentally, his name was Bill Maxwell. Bill said, well, you know, South Bend had a club from the 30s for like 30, 40 years, and they had all kinds of national champions and junior national champions there. And he said, you know, I'd like to tell you the history of the South Bend Table Tennis Club. And I'm sitting there thinking, I knew Notre Dame football and I knew that stuff, but I didn't know South Bend had a table tennis club. So he filled me in little by little as to what went on. So we went back to South Bend, and we kind of continued on. I can't really see the thing that's up here. Is that Betty? So the first picture you're going to have there is it's John Vargas sitting in the South Bend Club back in, that picture was back in the 40s, but it actually started back in the 30s. And there was a little room in the basement of that place. And you can go ahead and check the next one. Next one is the gymnasium at the YMCA. And they had 2 gymnasiums, and they used to conduct the St. Joe Valley in that gym every year. And it started in 1935-ish and went to around 1964, the St. Joe Valley. Go ahead, next one. The next one there's a gentleman sitting there, and I'm going to stop and talk about him. His name was W.B. Hester, which stands for Weldon B. And Weldon B. started the South Bend Table Tennis Club. And I found that out from Bill and just kind of researching because I love the history. I mean, here's my big thing, history, organization, in a sport that I love to play. So I actually wanted to see if I could find this man and get the actual story on how the South Bend Club started. And I called up the National YMCA in Minnesota, and I said, look, this is a strange phone call, but I'm trying to get a hold of a gentleman who was the boys' secretary in the South Bend YMCA in the mid-30s. And the lady says, well, let me look. And she was nice enough to actually look for me. And she came back and she said, you know, Brad, she said, I found a phone number. And I said, well, can I have it? I said, sure. So I got it. I called the number. Somebody answered, didn't say anything. And I said, you know, my name's Brad Balmer, and it's a strange phone call, but I'm looking for a gentleman named Weldon B. Hester, used to work at the YMCA in South Bend, Indiana. And all I hear is speaking. So I found this guy. It was like a miracle. And we did this in like 2000 or something. So, and he was already in his late 80s or something. And so I got to talking to him, and he told me the story of how the club started. And it was incredible. And I asked if he could write down, you know, kind of the history of the club, and he said, sure. So I'm going to read a couple things to you. And one thing that he sent me was, it's called the Table Tennis Tournament Information and Suggestion. And it was an 11-page program, pamphlet kind of thing that showed you how to run a table tennis tournament. And it starts out, it is most difficult for a tourney manager to get information on how to operate tournaments successfully, and about the only method has been the trial and error method process. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but at the end, he starts explaining it a little bit, and then he says, we hope it will be of help to someone, meaning this program. Well, when we started the St. Joe Valley back up in 1993, we had helped on different tournaments, Bill Horniak in Michigan City, all this, so we knew how to help, but we never ran a tournament. So we actually used this 11-page document on how to run a tournament that Weldon B. Hester, and it says here, Weldon B. Hester, South Bend, December 1939. And we used this to help us run our first year in 1993 at Notre Dame. We jumped in full-fledged because we had 50 tables, 300 players, and it was a really incredible deal there. So this is Weldon B., and I'm going to read one more thing that he wrote about the history. And this was about Betty Henry. He said, Betty was the one girl exception to our all-boy club. And she and John, who was our coach at the time, John Varga, became good friends. And John was her coach, of course. Betty, became an excellent player, and she and Betty's parents, particularly her father, were ambitious for her. This interest resulted in their sending her to the World Championships in London, England, which was in 1938, with her family paying all her expenses. And then he writes, Betty reached the semifinals. She had good newspaper coverage, of course. That was his words that Weldon B. sent to me. And I thought, you know, this was so great. So anyway, the club, you know, was kind of moving forward. You can go ahead and do the picture there. And these are just some slides of the club to give you an idea. This is John Varga, who started in 1936 at our club and was the coach there till about 1965. And if anybody who was in table tennis back in those years, they knew John Varga because he was quite an individual. Good, next one. The club itself had ups and downs, but in 1957, they went ahead and they actually hosted the U.S. Open in the gymnasiums at the YMCA. And this is a program about that. And then, go ahead. And actually, I got them reversed. That's the program. The one before it was the 52 national teams that we also held in those gymnasiums back then. So we held some big tournaments. Go ahead. This is just simply the entry blank. This is a 1993 entry blank that I put together, and we held that at Notre Dame. Go ahead. And that one there was from 1942, entry blank from the St. Joe Valley. Just kind of show you the difference in entry blanks. So go ahead. The next picture, it's kind of a famous picture. It was a meeting to form the Indiana Table Tennis Association. And in there is Weldon B. Hester, John Varga, and there's two individuals in there, Chauncey Gidsigan and Bill Horniak. And they were both original players in South Bend in 1935 when John Varga showed up. They were the original kids. And then also Jimmy McClure is in there too. He was part of the Indiana Table Tennis Association. Go ahead. South Bend produced tons of junior national champions. And one of them that we had is right up there. Her name is Sherry Chrisman Wilson. She went by Sherry Chrisman back then. And I knew of her, being kind of the historian of the club, and I tried to get in contact with her, and one day she just showed up at the club, and she hadn't played for decades. And she had her old Hock blade with her that had been in her attic for decades, and it had melted, the rubber, and there was like a pamphlet that melted to it. And she came in and she shook my hand. She says, "Hi, I'm Sherry Chrisman Wilson." And I says, "Oh my gosh, Sherry, I'm so glad you came." And she says, "I would like to start playing again. So can you fix my paddle?" She said. So she gave me her paddle, and I took it off, and I ended up, because I knew we had a lot of players from that era play at the club still, and I knew the style, so I actually put an anti-rubber on one side with very little, no sponge, I think, and then a half a mil sponge with some medium pips on the other. And I said, "Sherry, this is what you need to play with. You put the pips on the backhand." And so she started playing. In 6 months, she beat everybody in the club. That's how good she was. And then she went to the Vegas Nationals and she won the senior women's 2 times. And then, because of that, they inducted her into this organization, into the Hall of Fame. So she was one of many of the South Bend juniors that came through the ranks of the program. Go ahead. And then this picture here is actually Bill Horniak. And many of you knew him. He was one of our original South Bend. He kind of migrated to Michigan City, ended up starting a club there, had great tournaments, went around the world. His wife was a world champion. Her name was Liz. And they were great. They were the greatest people. But they all started as little kids at the South Bend Table Tennis Club on the YMCA. Go ahead. And then to move forward a little bit, the individual hitting with the kids, his name is Victor Tolkachev. We needed a coach, and this was in the early 90s. And I asked actually Daddy Seemiller, because I used to take the kids to his place to train sometimes. And he says, "We got a guy here from Latvia that's looking to be a coach somewhere." So we hired Victor, and he came in and he really got our junior program started again. More kids. We've always been kind of junior oriented at the South Bend Club. Go ahead. And there's a partial picture of some of our junior players at the time when Victor had to go back to Latvia, and then oddly enough, I asked Danny, I said, "Well, Danny, we need a new coach." I said, "You interested?" And I was actually kind of joking. And he looked at me and says, "Yeah." So Danny accepted that, and he came to South Bend, and he was our coach for 22 years. So, and that's just some of the players on there. It's coming. Next picture. Next picture right there. That little boy sitting there was probably one of the best we ever produced out of there, Mark Kaczynski. And he started with Victor. And then he ended up, Danny was his coach for a long time. And you know him, he's the U.S. Olympic coach now. But again, a kid from South Bend. Go ahead, one more. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but kind of why I'm doing this and why I was always so interested in the history and all the kids, but you got to realize it all started with one little girl. And that little girl was Betty Henry. And it started in the mid-30s at the club, but even before that, and Dennis is going to talk about it, she played in the basement in River Park in South Bend. And, it's not an easy time in the 30s leading up to the war in South Bend and all the problems, and it was just after the Great Depression. So, but this little girl wanted to play table tennis. And the basement back in the day on these houses, they were all heated by coal furnaces. So they all had a little coal room, and that means they had a lot of coal dust in the basement and all got on the walls and on the ceiling. But Dennis will talk about it. But that's where she started. And then she ended up playing, and her dad was coaching her and helping her. And then she came down to the club, the little room down in South Bend, and started playing. And then she went on, and Dennis is going to talk to her about her exploits. But I'm going to kind of finish this up with, when I was doing this, I had access to all these kids that grew up in table tennis from South Bend. And I asked them if they would kind of tell their story and just write it down so I could keep it and use it, And from the junior perspective, what they thought of the South Bend Table Tennis Club growing up in a club. And the individual you see right there, his name is Alan Levin. and he was one of our junior players in South Bend. And Alan's sitting right there, and Alan lives here now. And this is his wife, Emily, next to him, and they actually play at this club, even though they're from South Bend. And anyway, I'm going to read the letter that Alan wrote, because I just thought it was such a great letter, okay? So, South Bend memories from junior team member Alan Levin. Growing up in South Bend, Indiana, had some perks. Notre Dame was very close. The College Football Hall of Fame opened in my teen years. The absolute best thing in the local area had to offer for me was the South Bend Table Tennis Club. The club had a feeling of true history. Past national champions had been painted on the walls. The training center at the old Torrington Factor was beautiful. The floor was hard and the game was fast. For a while, I served as captain of the new South Bend junior team. At that time, 92 through 95, Mark Kosinski was under 5 foot tall and also under 1,200. Many of the junior players trained hard under Victor Tolkachev and Danny Seemiller. Danny Seemiller may not know it, but he remains one of the most positive influences on my life still today, far away as I strive to make it in the entertainment business here in LA, which he did make it. This was written a few years ago. He made it very well. Now, as I understand, some of the same junior players who could just barely see over the side of the table and grip a paddle are top players in the country for their age groups, including up to adult groupings. Playing table tennis did plenty for me as a teenager. It gave me focus, a team, a dream. I was able to associate with very good people. Table tennis people are the best people in the world. I learned that if I trained hard at any one thing, I could rise through the ranks and find my talent. I learned that hard work is rewarded with real progress. Hard work is always worth the effort. A memory I enjoy from my teenage years was helping to paint and create what I think of as my home, the South Bend Table Tennis Club. The dust in that what turned out to be our robot area was so thick we had to chisel it out. Paul George art was displayed and beautiful. We turned a lump of coal into a diamond. I greatly miss that establishment. I'm very thankful to the South Bend Table Tennis Club available to me as a young adult. Brad Balmer, Phil Schmucker, Paul George, Dan Seemiller, Jim Lynch, Jerry Geller, and so many others played a role in helping me grow up. It was my favorite community. In my mind, it hasn't changed a bit. You can still see Lloyd Troyer grunting as he takes a stroke. You can still see the sting of Dana Yoder's ridiculously accurate backhand and that swinging door, barn door style stroke. You can see Victor annihilate somebody 21-0, and that person quickly took a break from table tennis to cool down. You can watch Nathan Troyer and Randy Hewitt rising through the ranks, hot on my heels to pass me up. You can see Mark Kosinski smile or even lose his temper even now and then. And you can watch my dad, Mike Levin, hack his way to a victory without so much as one top spin stroke, despite Victor and Danny putting entirely way too much effort to help with this simple feat. You can watch matches from early to late hours and marvel at this beautiful sport of table tennis. I mean, I just think that was from a kid's perspective, and he wrote it as an adult, but that kind of shows you, and I have many of these from junior players, and that's kind of why I wanted to do this, is we've always been junior oriented at our club. I think juniors that is the future of the club. You gotta focus on them. If you don't have juniors, you know, it's gonna go away. And we've been there 90 years because we focused on juniors. And in final, it just basically, Betty Henry was the first junior, in effect, that first one that became a star of our club and kind of put South Bend on the map. And it's almost as if kind of Betty's spirit is kind of flows in the arteries of this club, the South Bend Table Tennis Club, because all these kids kind of followed, even though they weren't all like, didn't have her poster on the wall like nowadays, but she was the one that started it all, and everybody involved with the South Bend Table Tennis, they got involved because of the history and the accomplishment these kids have. So anyway, thank you for letting me talk about South Bend. Now you know probably more than you wanted to about our club. But, and thank you for inviting me. So at this point, I would like to introduce to you Dennis Henry, who is Betty Henry's nephew. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you and good evening. I'm Dennis Henry. With me today, representing Betty Ann Henry, later Link, my aunt, are my wife Cheryl, my two sisters Susan and Patricia, two brothers Timothy and Travis's wife Holly. So the seven of us are representing Betty today. We are children of Betty's youngest brother, who was born very late in her career and her life, and was very young when she ended up passing very, very early, and I'll show you a timeline in a minute. The slide that you're looking at now shows several period clippings that Betty made through her local US-based, predominantly Midwest, table tennis journey. Championships, tournaments, some exhibitions, all sorts of different table tennis events. And she took them into the book without considering any other background other than for her own memory. And so it's been a bit of a challenge for me to try to piece together what exactly are these things and where do they come from. And one of note is in the upper right-hand corner, which is a picture of Betty with a bunch of other kids from the club in her very first tournament that she won, just shy of 14 years old, by beating 30 other regional players. And so she was very, very proud of that. In a minute, I'll take you through a quote that Betty made that I pieced together from the newspaper reportings of that. But back in those days, that's how the communication happened for us. It was all newspapers. Occasionally in Betty's scrapbook, she made a handwritten or a typewritten account of her escapades. And when you read them, you can kind of get a little bit of a sense for how Betty was. Very, very to the point. And if she didn't like anything about a certain tournament or something that happened in a tournament, she said it. And I think that was just her very nature. She was very cognizant of her own being, and she loved doing what she was doing in this sport. Okay? In this slide, you don't see them because they're kind of small. I did that a little bit on purpose. But I'd like to mention three friends that if Betty were here today, I'm certain she would like to mention. One of those being Sally Green. She was a competitor with Sally, Sally being from Indianapolis, Betty being from South Bend. They got to know each other, and in our photos and in the scrapbook, many, many pictures of Betty and Sally together, stories of competitions, and then even when she became married later in life, Sally was there. And so Sally, being a competitor, was one of her close friends. John Varga, as a coach, was obviously someone that should be mentioned in the same breath with Betty. Without him, I'm sure Betty wouldn't have continued to improve to the level that she gained over those several years of playing table tennis. And then, of course, Jimmy McClure, I've learned through my research, was one of her mentors. A little bit of coaching, but he spoke highly of Betty and what he saw in her early on, and that's how she ultimately became one of the members of the team that went to London in 1938. Okay? I'd also like to recognize, and you'll see it in some of those pictures, Bendix. Bendix was originated in South Bend, a large company in South Bend, Indiana. Now it's part of Honeywell, but without Bendix and without her parents, she would not have been able to do the things that she did. So I thought it was appropriate for me to say a little bit of something about Bendix. Next slide. This slide is a brief timeline, and I put this together not to take you through a point-by-point detailed history of Betty, but to show you that she was born in 22 and died in 43, 22 years old. Okay? In that time, about a third of it was table tennis centric. So 6 years roughly is all she had in table tennis. And so if you think about her accomplishments in that short period of time, it's a little bit, to me, is a bit astonishing. In 41, my father was born, and Betty was about 19 at the time. Okay, so think about that dichotomy a little bit. 3 months later, her mom passed. That's when she retired from table tennis, because she had to take care of my father, a 3-month-old, and our uncle, who was 8 by then. And so a little bit of a history, and put that in perspective about what was going on with Betty and how her table tennis journey became interrupted so abruptly. And a couple of other interesting things I've learned as I've taken this journey of understanding Aunt Betty. I knew that she lived in River Park, the same neighborhood that we all grew up in, but I had no idea that she went to our exact same primary school. And in those days, it was K through 9. Well, all of us, many of us, went through the same school, John F. Nooner, K through 8. Played on the same fields. We're in the same classrooms. And so it's a bit of astonishing to see that Betty did that. On the next slide for me. Family was important to Betty. She's featured in many, many of the family photos. The stories in the newspapers of the time talked about Betty and her father and how her father got started. I learned that her father actually played lawn tennis and taught Betty at 10 years old to play lawn tennis. She ended up winning a lawn tennis tournament at the age of 10 as a small child playing tennis competitively in South Bend. Her mother, Lelia, also supported Betty, obviously, by taking care of all the things that were not related to the sport, by making sure that she arrived at her place where she needed to be, had the money to do the things that she needed, and all those sorts of things that moms tend to do and get forgotten about. The middle picture that you see there is a good picture of the close, very, very close family that Betty had, and Betty was around most of her life. Obviously, at the bottom are her parents, Bob and Lelia, and of course they're also on the left-hand side of that slide, standing with Betty as a baby. In the back row, right behind her mom and dad, are her aunt and her uncle. As the story goes, she would eventually die in their home. So very, very close people for them. And then on the still standing, the older lady to the right, that's Grandma Sarah. And Grandma Sarah certainly looks like the kind of gal that would make sure that you ate your Brussels sprouts, right? And then, of course, that picture shows Grandpa and Grandma Henry looking at something, and I have no idea what they're looking at. So, but think about that time period. Probably the late 20s, early 30s, and I have a picture of that, right, with Betty at that young age. Next slide. This slide's a little bit of Betty's non-table tennis athletics. I learned through this journey that she, as I said earlier, played tennis. I also learned that Grandpa Bob, her father, also played tennis at the high school competitively. And he also played tennis in the industrial leagues in and around South Bend. Industrial leagues in South Bend were pretty big with Studebaker, Bendix, Singer, sewing machines. And so lots of opportunity to play all sorts of games from marbles to football in the city of South Bend. And of course, those were tennis and table tennis were also in there. In the lower picture on the right, you'll see a picture of a field hockey team. I learned through my research that she earned a letter at John F. Nooner School, the school that we all went to, just as many of us have earned letters there, in field hockey as a ninth grader. I didn't know that before this journey. And because of this opportunity, I learned that. And you don't think about it, but what does field hockey have to do with table tennis? Well, they're both hitting a ball. Maybe a little bit different playing field, but they both have to have that precise hand-to-eye capability and skill to be able to be competitive in that arena. And also, you'll notice a bunch of pictures of swimming. So the family being from northern Indiana, lots of opportunity to swim in local lakes, and one of the cherished things that they did was go to Lake Michigan and swim. And so swimming was obviously something that they did for the family. The famous coal cellar story. This is the home in River Park. 3 pictures of her playing in that cellar. One newspaper article that I read about Betty in these escapades was that she didn't have anybody else to play with in the neighborhood. And when Dad wasn't around, she played by herself. And I can only envision how she might have done that with probably a very rudimentary table tennis board, right? In the basement with one light bulb. And if you think back for a minute, light bulbs had just started to come into homes at the time. So they got rid of coal, so now I have a place to play, and I have to have electricity to have a light bulb, because 10 years earlier it would have been kerosene. And so this whole story of Betty's perseverance in the face of some pretty stiff things to have to do just shows you the kind of gal that she was to get to attain the level that she was at. Going back to that story about the very first tournament she was in, I'm going to read this quote, and I had to do a little bit of doctoring to get it to flow right. But this was a bit of a quote from her, right out of the newspaper. "I had just learned the game when I heard about a tournament here in South Bend. I had no idea of winning and would face the city champion in my first match. I was frightened almost to death, but got up enough courage and entered the tournament." Now, this is a 13, almost 14-year-old, right? "By sheer luck, I won one game. By sheer luck, I won that match. I battled my way to the finals, and after losing one game along the way, I took one look at that trophy, and that inspired me to not give up. And I finally won. Now I have 20 trophies and 17 other awards at my home a year later." Okay? Kind of an astonishing thing for a 14, 15-year-old to accomplish in that short period of time. Go to the next one. A little bit about Betty and her school. So I alluded to the point that Nooner School, the primary education that she had was in the school that many of us had, and rooms that we recognize. So when you look at the left-hand side of that frame, you'll see a couple of rooms with the 9th graders in their 9th grade picture. That was all of our kindergarten room. And when I look back at that picture, that room hadn't changed from the time they took that picture in '37 to 1966 when I was there. And so that just is a piece of Betty's history that means so much to our family to this day. Something that I hadn't seen since I was in that classroom in 1966. And here it is with Betty in that frame. There's also a bit of a story about Betty and her social activities. And so the picture in the courtyard looking area there at Nooner, it noted in the paper that she and a gal named Jane Bell were in charge of the program for that May celebration event in the 7th grade. And as I did research for Betty, I found out that she had lots of things like that going on in addition to her schooling, in addition to her table tennis work. She was having socials with friends all around the neighborhood as part of what she did and just her outgoing personality. And then, of course, you see the pictures there of her high school senior picture. And noted in that, she was in the Riley High School Table Tennis Club and ultimately a president, and other accomplishments that she had along the way. Things that I had no idea of until I started digging a little bit to try to really understand this. Back to the family a little bit on this next slide. The center picture is Betty between the years of 42 and 44, roughly. I said Betty had died in 43. Actually, she died in 44. But that time frame, she got married. And I believe this is after she was married. My uncle's the guy with the little sailor suit on. Uncle Pat is what we call him. And he was about 8 at that point in time. And my dad was about 3 years old at that point in time. And shortly after this picture, she passed along, leaving her husband behind and leaving my dad and our uncle to the rest of the family to deal with. The pictures on the sides, so on the left-hand side, you can see that picture with my uncle sitting there amongst her 20 trophies that she talked about previously. So I've got that photo, which is kind of, it's a family photo. It's not an official photo of anything. It's a family photo that we have of her trophies. And then the photo on the right-hand side is my Uncle Pat chewing on a paddle out in the field. And it's like, I wish I had that picture when he was still alive, because I would have given him a hard time about that. All right. And then, of course, in 1941, her mother passed, our grandmother, my dad's mom, and she became their surrogate mom. And that kind of put the brakes on her table tennis career by a pretty substantial margin. The next page shows Betty and her marriage to Ed Link. So the Link name comes from Ed, and I have no idea how they met. I have no idea how the courtship went. I do know that she was married in '43. Ed was a Navy radioman. He went to the University of Cincinnati, got pulled out to go teach classes in Chicago at the Great Lakes Naval Station. And somewhere in there, they managed to be a couple, and she got reintroduced to table tennis for a short period of time. And then again in '44, she passed along, and the history stopped for her there. The one big mystery along all of these things, whatever happened to all the trophies and awards? We just don't know. And I think it has a lot to do with the chaos in the family, a lot to do with just the different deaths that were happening in the family of people in their natural course of events. And we've never been able to find trophies or put our hands on any story about what happened to them. I've got a few hypotheses, but really nothing solid to say anything about. And the last page is another one of her scrapbooks. So she had two scrapbooks, one of her escapades in the United States and in the US, different tournaments, regionally and locally, Indianapolis, Toledo, all over the place, Chicago, things of that nature. I don't believe she went any further west than St. Louis. I know that she played a couple of times on the East Coast. I don't think she ever went further south than maybe Evansville. So if you think about that and the impact that she made on the game, it's pretty astonishing. But this is a synopsis of her table tennis work over in London. So these are pictures that she got predominantly from the London press for her scrapbook in London. And the one thing that just was the most, and I put one picture of one phrase up there that I've not been able to lay my hands on that newspaper article. A lot of these pictures I can find exactly who took them and what day it was and all that sort of thing. But the Lightning Kid of table tennis was the one that caught my eye. And that was repeated throughout the United States press, but I could never find the source article in London. But apparently she had that reputation as being a kid that was just light on her feet and very, very fast with a paddle. And so that's how she ended up being number 3 in the world over the course of a few years later. And I think a record that still lives to this day is she was the youngest woman to ever compete in the worlds at that point in time to win a medal, and that record still holds today. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share a little bit about Aunt Betty.